Totemist. Whispers at 13,000 feet. My boyfriend Timothy was always the adventurous type, the kind of person who'd rather climb a mountain alone than spend a weekend at a crowded resort. That's what I loved about him, his fearless spirit and the way his eyes lit up whenever he talked about his next expedition. I remember the evening he told me about his plans to hike Mount Logan in winter. We were having dinner at our usual spot, this cozy Italian place downtown where we had our first date. The excitement in his eyes was unmistakable as he showed me his route on his phone, barely touching his favorite mushroom risotto. "Look at this, Sarah," Timothy said, zooming in on the map. "It's the perfect challenge. 3 days up, 2 days down, just me and the mountain." He went on to explain how he'd been training for months, doing practice climbs in lower elevations, and testing his gear in various weather conditions. "I've got it all planned out. I'll start from the King Trench route, make camp at around 10,000 feet the first night, then push to 13,000 the second day. The summit attempt will be on day 3. 2 years of watching him disappear into the wilderness had taught me his patterns. The spark in his eyes, the confident set of his shoulders, the meticulous planning. But as he mapped out his route up Mount Logan, those familiar patterns shifted. His hands, which could thread a rope through a carabiner in howling wind, now trembled as he zoomed in on the summit. He was super excited, of course, but the mountain had already begun changing him, and he hadn't even started climbing. The week before his departure was strange. Timothy, usually so confident and carefree, started having trouble sleeping. He'd spend hours checking and rechecking his gear, making lists, and watching weather forecasts. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to find him sitting at his desk, poring over topographical maps and elevation charts. One night, I found him watching old documentaries about mountain rescue operations. "I found my old lucky compass," Timothy told me one evening. "Mom gave it to me when I first started hiking. Weird how it turned up now, right?" He kept turning it over in his hands, watching the needle swing back and forth. "It's still perfectly accurate after all these years. The etching on the back is a bit worn, though. See how it says, 'Find your true north'?" Mom always had a way with words. His family was worried too. His sister Jenny called me twice that week, asking if I could talk him out of it, but we both knew Timothy. Once he set his mind on something, there was no changing it. His father, typically supportive of Timothy's adventures, had gone unusually quiet when told about the winter expedition. During our last family dinner before the trip, I noticed how his dad kept glancing at the weather reports on his phone. I tried to keep my concerns to myself, but they spilled out during dinner 3 nights before his departure. "Why does it have to be winter?" I asked. "The same route would be just as challenging in summer, wouldn't it?" Timothy shook his head, stirring his untouched drink. "It's different in winter," he explained. "The mountain shows its true nature. Plus, there's something about being the only person up there, surrounded by nothing but snow and sky. It's pure, you know? The way the wind shapes the snow into these incredible formations, how the ice catches the light at sunrise. It's like being on another planet." The morning he left, I drove him to the airport. The pre-dawn air was bitter cold, and fog shrouded the streetlights in ghostly halos. He had his GoPro ready, talking about making an inspiring video of his journey. "I want to show people what it's really like up there," he said, adjusting the camera mount on his chest. "Not just the pretty views, but the real experience. The sound of crampons on ice, the way your breath freezes in the air, That moment when you break through the cloud layer and it's just you and the summit. That's when his phone buzzed with a message from his mom. "Mom's being superstitious again," Timothy said with a laugh, showing me the text. "She's telling me about some old folklore about requesting assistance in times of need. Apparently, if you repeat your plea 3 times, it attracts attention from protective spirits or something. She probably read it on one of those mystery blogs she follows." "Maybe there's wisdom in old stories," I said. But Timothy was already checking his flight details, not listening. In the terminal, he went through his final equipment check. Each item had its place in his heavy-duty backpack: emergency beacon, satellite phone, first aid kit, high-calorie rations, thermal gear, and his treasured ice axes. The GoPro was secured to his chest, ready to capture every moment of his ascent. He'd even packed a small notebook to document his journey the old-fashioned way. I hugged him goodbye at the security checkpoint, breathing in his familiar scent of pine-scented soap and coffee. "Promise you'll be careful?" I asked. "Always am," Timothy replied, grinning. "I'll show you the video when I get back. It's going to be amazing." He kissed me one last time and walked through security, turning back to wave before disappearing around the corner. That was the last time I saw him. The first sign something was wrong came 3 days later, when his scheduled check-in call never came. I told myself it was just poor reception or a drained satellite phone battery. But when he missed the second check-in the following day, I called the park rangers. The authorities found his campsite 2 weeks later, after the weather finally cleared enough for a search. His tent was still perfectly set up, his supplies organized, everything color-coded and labeled, just like he'd shown me during his practice runs in the backyard. His sleeping bag was still rolled out neatly, and even his half-eaten energy bars were stored in Ziploc bags marked with dates and times. The only things missing were his camera and his lucky compass. It took another week to locate the rest of his equipment, scattered across the snow about 2 miles from his camp. The camera was damaged, but the memory card was intact. I couldn't bring myself to watch the footage for weeks, but when I finally did, I understood why the search team looked so shaken. The first few days of footage were exactly what Timothy had hoped to capture. His initial excitement was evident as he filmed the helicopter drop-off point, the pristine snow stretching endlessly in every direction. "Day 1 on Mount Logan," his voice narrated, slightly breathless from the altitude. "The air is so clean up here, it almost hurts to breathe. Look at how the sunlight hits the glacier. It's like diamonds scattered across the snow." He documented everything meticulously, setting up his first camp, demonstrating his rope techniques, even showing his evening routine of melting snow for water and preparing his dehydrated meals. "The silence up here is incredible," he commented during a stunning sunset shot. "You can actually hear the ice creaking in the glacier below. It's like the mountain is alive, breathing with you." Day 2's footage showed him making good progress, though the wind had picked up. "Breaking through 12,000 feet today," he reported, his breath crystallizing in front of the lens. "The weather's holding, but watch this." The camera panned to the northern sky, where dark clouds twisted into impossible shapes, forming and unforming like living things. "They've been doing this for an hour now. No storm system I've ever studied moves like that." But the final clip was different. The camera was shaking violently, and Timothy's voice had lost all its confidence. The sky behind him was dark with storm clouds, and the wind howled like a living thing. The snow was falling so heavily it looked like static on the screen. "I can't feel my fingers anymore," Timothy's voice trembled in the recording. The storm came out of nowhere. I can't see the markers. The GPS is malfunctioning. It keeps showing me in different locations. My compass. He paused, and the camera swung down to show the compass spinning wildly in his shaking hands. Something's wrong. The needle won't stop spinning. I can't. I need help. Please, I need help. Please, I need. The video cut off there, but when the park rangers pieced together the remaining fragments, they found one final frame. They said it was probably storm damage or a camera malfunction, but I've watched it countless times now. That skeletal figure in the background, almost blending in with the snowy pines. It wasn't a malfunction. Through the static and snow, I saw it. Tall as 3 men, with twisted antlers and yellow eyes that pierced through the darkness. It moved like smoke, too graceful for something so large. I still have Timothy's lucky compass. It showed up in my mailbox a month after the search was called off, with no note or explanation. The metal was ice cold to the touch, despite the warm spring day. The etching on the back is different now. The words "Find your true north" are gone, replaced by 3 deep scratches that look almost like claw marks. The compass has developed its own rhythm now. Every night at 3 a.m., when the world feels thinnest, the needle abandons magnetic north and strains toward the mountains, as if it's trying to tell me something. I'm sharing this because I need people to understand. The mountains hold secrets we can't comprehend. Timothy always said, nature demands respect, but I think he learned too late that it demands fear too. They never found Timothy's body. The case remains open, labeled as a hiking accident. In his notebook, which they found at his first campsite, Timothy's last entry reads, "The mountain doesn't care about our dreams or ambitions. Up here, we're all just visitors in an ancient place." I wonder if anyone else has heard the whispers in the wind. The rest of the page is blank, except for 3 words written in handwriting that doesn't quite look like his. I need help. Twice lived. I was married for 8 years to David. We had a nice house in Boston, good jobs, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, we were like 2 people speaking different languages, getting more confused and frustrated every day by each other's company. After many failed attempts at couples counseling and therapy, it eventually led to us filing for a divorce. The divorce itself wasn't dramatic. No fighting, no screaming, just a slow, quiet acceptance that we'd become strangers living in the same house. Nonetheless, I'd say it was still pretty traumatic. The day I signed the papers, I went home and looked at our wedding photos. 8 years of memories stared back at me, and I realized I didn't recognize myself anymore. That's when I decided to move to Nova Scotia. People thought I was crazy, moving to another country right after a divorce. Why not just get an apartment in the city? My sister kept asking. But I needed more than just a new apartment. I needed a place where every street corner wouldn't remind me of my failed marriage. I picked Millbrook because it looked nothing like Boston. It's one of those small towns by the ocean where everyone knows everyone else, where the fog comes in every morning and makes the whole world look new. I found a cottage to rent online, just a small place with wooden walls and old windows. But when I saw the pictures, I felt a sense of peace, knowing it'd be the right decision for me. My first week in Millbrook was quiet. I spent a lot of time walking around town, learning the streets, figuring out which coffee shop had the best muffins and which grocery store wasn't too expensive. The locals were friendly but curious. You could tell they wanted to ask questions but were too polite to pry. I started making my rental cottage feel like home. I hung curtains, bought some plants, arranged my books on the shelves. Every morning, I'd walk down to the beach and watch the fishing boats head out. Sometimes, I'd sit there for hours, listening to the waves and thinking about how different this was from my old life. No more rush hour traffic, no more endless meetings, no more pretending to be happy in a marriage that had stopped working years ago. At night, I'd sit on my little porch with a cup of tea and watch the stars. You can't see stars like that in Boston. Here, they fill up the whole sky. I started feeling like I'd definitely made the right choice in coming here, and I was beginning to think I could even build a new life in this quiet place by the ocean. Then came the day at the vehicle licensing office. I needed to get a Nova Scotia driver's license. Just normal paperwork, the kind of thing you do when you move somewhere new. The office was small, just 3 desks and a few chairs in the waiting area. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, typed my name into her computer, and I watched her face change as she stared at the screen. She looked at me, then back at the screen, then at me again. "This can't be right," she said, turning her monitor around. "According to our records, you've been living here for 5 years, at 156 Cedar Lane." I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. But then, I saw my driver's license on the screen. My face, my name, my birthday. Everything was exactly right, except for an address I'd never seen and an issue date from 5 years ago. "There must be some mix-up," I said. But the woman in the photo was undeniably me, just different. She was the version of me I hoped to become when I moved here, someone who had found her place in the world. I sat in silence for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts and make sense of what had just happened. Then, after a long minute of staring at one spot, I smiled at the clerk and said I must have mixed up some paperwork at reception and would go back to sort it out. But as soon as I stood up and left the clerk's desk, I walked straight out of that office. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. A new fear crept in. Had someone, by some ridiculous stroke of luck, stolen my identity? That would have been the perfect cherry on top of an already traumatic life change, I thought to myself. I had to know more. That's how I found myself walking to Cedar Lane that afternoon. The street was on the edge of town, where the paved roads turned to gravel. The house sat back from the road, 2 stories, blue paint that needed touching up, and a porch with an old swing. As I approached the house, I paused at the bottom of the porch steps. I smoothed my palms against my jeans, just needing to feel something solid and real. The doorbell echoed inside when I pressed it, but no one answered. I tried again, and the only response was the creak of that old porch swing moving in the breeze. After checking all the windows and finding them locked, I turned back to the front door. My hand reached for the handle, and the door opened at my touch as it knew me. The first step inside felt like crossing an invisible boundary into a space between reality and dream. The air hit me in layers, the mustiness of an empty house, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, and beneath it, lavender, coffee grounds, and old books. Lived in, homey smells. I walked down the hallway, past closed doors, into a kitchen that looked recently abandoned. An unwashed mug sat in the sink, mail scattered on the counter, and a grocery list magneted to the fridge, written in my handwriting. I couldn't make sense of it. I picked up the list and touched the words with my fingertips, my breath quickening from the overwhelming coincidence. I rushed to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face and check my reflection, hoping to confirm I wasn't dreaming. I stood there with my head down, staring at the sink, taking slow breaths to steady myself. My pulse began to settle, but when I opened the medicine cabinet, I froze, as if time itself had stopped. There, on the middle shelf, sat a bottle of my shampoo. Not just the same brand, but the exact same bottle, with a small dent in the cap where I dropped it that morning while unpacking in my rental cottage. I stepped out of the bathroom, ready to flee from the madness. But then my eyes caught something in the hallway. Photos. My world tilted sideways. They were everywhere. On the walls, shelves, side tables. Me standing by the ocean. Me laughing with a gray-haired woman I didn't know. Me in a green coat I didn't own, standing in front of this house in spring. That was enough. I bolted, racing back to my cottage as fast as I could. That night, I dreamed about the house. But it wasn't like normal dreams. I knew things I shouldn't have known, like how the third step from the bottom always creaked, how the upstairs bathroom window stuck unless you pushed it just right, the exact spot on the porch where you could watch storms roll in from the ocean. I woke up in a different bed, not my rental cottage bed, a different one, with different sheets and different light coming through the windows. My phone was on an unfamiliar nightstand, but it unlocked with my fingerprint. The messages inside made my head spin. Work emails about projects I'd never heard of. Texts from people I didn't know, but who seemed to know me. Years of conversations I couldn't remember having. I went downstairs and realized I was in the house at 156 Cedar Lane. The grocery list I'd taken yesterday was on the floor, and the medicine cabinet I'd checked last night was still open. I got out of the house screaming in my pajamas and ran back to the cottage. Outside, everything felt off. The town looked the same but muted, as if someone had drained the color from the world. I rushed back to my rental cottage, but inside it was empty and thick with dust, as if no one had lived there for years. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, too heavy to fight. The last thing I felt was the floor rushing up to meet me. Then night came, and I woke up back in my regular life. My rental cottage, my normal phone, my real world. But the next morning, it happened again. And again, and again. Every morning, I'm Rachel, who's lived here for years, with friends and a job and a whole life I can't remember making, but somehow know by heart. And every night, I'm Rachel, who just moved here, still hurting from the divorce, still trying to figure out my new life. The memories started mixing together. I'd remember picking paint colors for the living room, but also seeing those same walls for the first time. I'd meet someone at the grocery store and feel like we'd been friends for years, even as we exchanged small talk like strangers. At first, I tried to make sense of it. I left notes for myself in both houses. I drew on my arm with a permanent marker before bed, testing if the marks would appear in the other world. They did. This wasn't a dream. The wall between my two lives was wearing thin. Last night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, or maybe both bathroom mirrors at once, and saw two versions of myself looking back. One still looked haunted by the divorce, with dark circles under her eyes. The other looked more settled, more at home in her skin. All of us reached out to touch the glass at the same time. The mirror rippled like a puddle in the rain, and suddenly, there was just one me looking back. But I'm not sure which me it is anymore. The memories crashed together like waves. I remembered planting roses in the garden, something I'd done years ago in one life, but hadn't done yet in another. I remembered my neighbor teaching me how to plant them just right. In one life, I hadn't met her yet. In the other, I'd held her hand at her husband's funeral last winter. The gray-haired woman in the photos, Margaret, once told me that time isn't like a river flowing one way. It's more like an ocean, touching every shore at once. In one life, she told me this years ago. In another, we haven't had that conversation yet. The house doesn't let me pick which life I wake up in anymore. Each night, I go to sleep not knowing which version of my life I'll step into when I wake up. But strangely, I'm not scared anymore. Maybe this is what it means to accept something impossible. Not fighting it, but accepting it. Both lives are mine. They always were. The house knew this all along, waiting for me to understand what it means to be multiple versions of yourself at once. The person who just left everything behind, and the person who built everything new. Come back to me. It started 2 weeks ago, after a stupid fight with my girlfriend Laura. We'd been dating for 3 years and living together in Toronto for the past 6 months. The argument was about something so trivial now, me forgetting her mother's birthday dinner. I was caught up with work, but that's no excuse. The fight escalated quickly. Laura called me selfish, and she wasn't wrong. I'd been distant lately, missing important dates, forgetting to ask about her day. The promotion at work had consumed me, and I'd let everything else slip away. But instead of apologizing, I got defensive. I said things I can't take back, dismissed her feelings, made it all about me, again. When she grabbed her coat and keys, I should have stopped her, should have apologized, should have done anything except stand there and watch her leave. The door slammed so hard, our framed photos fell to the ground. Through the window, I watched her storm down the street, her red coat a bright splash against the gray evening. My calls went straight to voicemail. I kept dialing, pacing faster with each recorded, "Hi, you've reached Laura." Outside, the temperature dropped as night settled in. Toronto winters are brutal, and she hadn't taken her scarf or gloves. After a few hours, my phone finally rang. But it wasn't Laura. It was an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was professional, detached. There had been an incident at the intersection near our building. Laura was being transported to Toronto General Hospital. She was unresponsive. My phone fell from my palm, and I didn't hear the rest of what the doctor told me. My ears were ringing. The room started spinning, and I had to sit down on the floor. I kept hearing those words over and over. Incident. Unresponsive. They didn't sound real. Laura couldn't be hurt. She was just angry at me. She was just walking to cool off. This couldn't be happening. I rushed to the hospital, checking my phone every 2 minutes, hoping someone would call with any updates. Nobody did. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Laura was between life and death, all because of a stupid argument and my arrogance. The next few hours at the hospital were just a mix of bright lights and antiseptic smells. The doctors tried to explain the situation to me, but I still couldn't process it. They talked about black ice on the crosswalk, about a driver who couldn't stop in time. After a sleepless night, I eventually had to go home to clean up. But as soon as I walked into our apartment, I broke down crying. All this stress, and now this? I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. But when I looked up, there was Laura. In the mirror, right behind my reflection, she was standing there in the same clothes from earlier, just watching me. I spun around so fast I almost slipped, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, it was just my own pale face staring back. I told myself I needed sleep, that stress was making me imagine things. But then it kept happening. I'd catch glimpses of her in reflective surfaces, store windows as I walked to the hospital, the black screen of my laptop before it lit up, the windows of the subway car, always with the same expression, just observing, never angry, never sad, just watching me. I started covering the mirrors in our apartment. I turned my phone face down. I kept my laptop closed until I absolutely needed it. But she found other ways to appear, in puddles after rain, in the chrome of the elevator doors, in the reflection of my coffee cup. Each time, my heart would stop for a moment, and I'd wonder if I was losing my mind. My coworkers started noticing something was wrong. I caught their whispered conversations, their concerned glances. My boss suggested I take some time off. But being alone in the apartment was worse. At least the office was lit up so bright that I couldn't see reflections anywhere. I started taking different routes to the hospital, avoiding the glass-fronted buildings along Bay Street. I stopped wearing my watch because I kept seeing her in its face. I ordered delivery instead of going to stores. But isolation only made the appearances more frequent, more intense. I was exhausted from barely sleeping, jumping at every reflection I saw. Maybe that's why I dozed off in the hospital chair one afternoon, the moment I sat down to see Laura. When I opened my eyes, the usual beeping of medical equipment seemed muffled, far away, and Laura's breathing sounded fainter than usual. The room felt colder, and the shadows in the corners looked darker somehow. My phone screen suddenly lit up on its own, even though it was face down on the side table. I knew what I would see if I turned it over. Her face was there, clearer than ever before, her eyes locked on mine. When the doctors came for their evening rounds, they said Laura's condition was getting worse. I wanted to stay, but after days without proper sleep, they insisted I go home to rest. Said I wouldn't be any help to Laura if I collapsed. I didn't want to go back to the apartment, but I had no choice. The moment I pushed open the door, I stopped dead. Every mirror I had covered was uncovered somehow. All the sheets and blankets I'd used were folded neatly on the floor, with those perfect hospital corners Laura always did. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm hits. And there she was, in our full-length bedroom mirror, the one we'd bought together at that antique store on Queen Street. Her lips were moving, just slightly. I found myself walking closer, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Her whisper was so faint I almost missed it. "Come back to me." Her whisper changed, growing louder. You did this to me, Ethan. I stumbled backward as her voice filled the room. She was in every mirror now, every screen, even the darkened windows. Her face twisted with anger I'd never seen before. I loved you, and you let me walk away. You let me walk out into the cold. You let me. Her scream pierced through the glass, making me cover my ears. But I couldn't block out her voice. 3 years, Ethan. 3 years I gave you everything, and you couldn't give me one night, one dinner, one moment of your precious time. The mirror started vibrating. Hairline cracks spread across its surface like spider webs. My phone screen shattered in my pocket. In the window, her reflection pounded against the glass. If you ever loved me. She wasn't screaming anymore, but her quiet voice was somehow worse. If any part of you ever cared, go to my room. There's something in my coat pocket. The coat I wore that night. Look at it, please. I ran. Past the cracking mirrors, past the shattering windows. Her voice followed me down the stairs, through the lobby. Hurry, Ethan, before it's too late, before we're both gone forever. When I got to the hospital, I went straight to her room. The coat was there, still stained from that night. My hands shook as I reached into the pocket. There was a small paper, folded carefully. A sonogram, dated 3 days before our fight. The paper trembled in my hands. 8 weeks. She had been 8 weeks along. That's why she'd been so tired lately. Why she kept getting sick in the mornings. Why this family dinner was so important. I turned to look at Laura in her hospital bed, but her machines made a long, continuous beep that made the nurses come running. As they rushed past me, I saw Laura's reflection one last time in the window. She was looking sad, one hand resting on her stomach as her image slowly faded away.